It's important to remember that in the British context, there are a few calculations going on at the same time. The first, which is mostly shared by the Foreign Office, is to try to guide the Arab revolutions so that they remain revolutions about the reform of the Arab political system rather than becoming anti-Western revolution or perhaps getting a tinge of Islamic fundamentalism. There's also a feeling somehow that Britain should be on the right side of history by appearing to supporting change rather than the status quo. But then there are other games. There is the fact that the Foreign Office has seemed incompetent, wrong-footed in this crisis right from January this year, and that therefore it was rushing to show that it knows what it wants to do, and that the British Prime Minister, who periodically was accused of not being aware of what is going on, and who also wanted to reassert his own control. The result is a sort of jerky policy which moves between thoughtfulness, a discussion about how the Middle East would look in the future, and immediate reactions designed to please the crowds. So we suddenly have a Prime Minister who talks about no-fly zones without any deep thought about what this means, without any calculation about what is the international legal context for this operation, and indeed even without ascertaining whether others in Europe are going to support such a move. You then ended up in the rather curious situation where you have an American military commanders basically deriding the British position. In reality, however, all this was a question of packaging. The truth remains that 2 weeks after the no-fly zone was first mooted, still we have no international consensus on it, and we are where we were at the beginning, which is that a certain number of countries, the United States, Britain, perhaps France, the same motley crew which always likes to call itself the international community, will be able to do a no-fly zone if they wish, on their own, without any international legal backing. We could have done it 2 weeks ago. We may end up doing it after this weekend when NATO and the European Union hold their summits, but it ain't a very coherent policy. It's a very strange kind of situation because at one level, the problems of North Africa and the Middle East, the question of the numbers of young unemployed, the unresponsiveness of old systems to the demands of the population. All this was normal fare in every academic conference for the last 20 years. Everyone knew that these were the problems facing the Middle East. And yet, mysteriously, nobody did any contingency planning. Nobody tried to ask the sort of out-of-the-box question, if one could use that cliche, about what will happen if the populations of the Middle East suddenly decide that they don't want to put up with the leaders that they've got. All this came as a complete surprise. It's a classic indication of the problem that the Foreign Office has, in conjunction perhaps with many other foreign ministries around the world, which is that it has no institutional memory. It deals from one story to the next. It stumbles from one crisis to the next. It never seems to afford the time or the resources to think in a long perspective. And the situation is getting worse. For instance, the one element in the Foreign Office that has been cut over the last few decades has been precisely the research analysts, the people whose job it is to look at long-term sort of planning. And unfortunately, this has immediate consequences. It was not only that the Foreign Office was surprised, but it also looked incompetent. It scrambled to try to arrange the evacuation of British citizens from Libya. It fumbled its lines. One moment it considered President Mubarak of Egypt as a pillar of stability. The next moment it asked him to get out of the way. It then sort of showed support for governments in the Gulf, showed support for demonstrators in the Gulf, and claimed that business as usual as far as it comes to commercial activities. In short, this has consequences. It is not merely a question of surprise, but it's also a question of the credibility of the foreign policy with the British public. I think on the whole, the record of the British Prime Minister's involvement in the Middle East has been a mixed bag. On the one hand, one could argue that Britain did better than France, whose foreign policy collapsed appallingly in North Africa, particularly where the French had an enormous amount of influence. One could say that Britain did better than that. At the very least, it had a high profile in these discussions on the Middle East, and a sort of engagement which many other governments in the West did not show. But at the same time, it is still a fact that it was a reactive policy, always going one step behind, without any clear idea how the process in the Middle East could be encouraged and sustained. Indeed, we still don't have any clear idea. The European Union is holding a special summit on Friday to discuss what to do. There's absolutely no consensus whether any funding should be moved to sustain democratic governments in North Africa, and absolutely no idea what relationship the European Union would have with new democratic Arab states. Probably the most interesting comparison between the crisis in the Balkans in the early 90s and the crisis in the Middle East today is that you've got a gaggle of Western leaders who are looking at the situation they do not understand, who know what they want to avoid but have no idea how to do it, who are pushed by public opinion to appear to be doing something, who come up with supposedly military solutions which will preserve all our soldiers out of harm's way, but somehow achieve what we want to do on the ground, who rely on air power to supposedly deliver everything, and who have an idea of what they want to see on the ground without actually understanding the dynamics of the situation. That, in a way, is similar to what we had in the Balkans in the 1990s, and it ended up both with a large military intervention and with no credibility for the West and with a resentment on the ground for years to come. I hope we can avoid the same outcome in the Middle East. I'm not so sure. A great deal of British foreign policy would depend in the Middle East on how we see the region developing. My guess is that some of the monarchies of the Gulf, which are very close to Britain, will probably survive this wave of political turmoil because they certainly contain a certain amount of legitimacy locally and are perceived as such. The British policy should be to guide the policy of Europe towards the Middle East into a real policy of engagement with NGOs, with non-state actors, with the civil society that is coming up there, rather than only with leaders in the way that Western policy towards the region was conducted for decades. Ultimately, I think it requires a change of mind. It requires an acceptance in London, as well as many other capitals, that there is no such thing as the Arab exceptionalism, that Arabs, like almost any other person on the planet, do not wish to be run and governed badly, do wish to be consulted, and are capable of organizing their own lives.